I learned the difference between being underestimated and being invisible the night my family laughed at my job. My name is Claire Bennett, and the joke landed 5 minutes before everything changed. We were gathered in my parents' dining room on a quiet Thursday night, the kind of pre-celebration dinner that always came before something important. This time, it was the $5 million loan meeting scheduled for the next morning, my family's last shot at saving their manufacturing business. The table was crowded with confidence. My father talked numbers like he already owned the money. My older brother, Ethan, kept checking his phone, bragging about future expansions that didn't exist yet. My mother smiled the way she always did when she believed the room was impressed. And then there was me. I sat at the end of the table, nursing a glass of water, listening. I'd come straight from work, still in a simple blazer, nothing flashy. No logos. No drama. That alone seemed to bother them. "So, Claire," Ethan said, leaning back in his chair, smirking. "Still at that? What is it again? Admin job?" The table laughed. Light, polite laughter. The kind that pretends it's harmless. "It's finance," I replied calmly. Dad waved his hand. "Same thing. Paper pushing. At least it's stable, right?" He chuckled. "Someone's got to keep the basic jobs running while the rest of us build real wealth." My mother added, "She's always been practical. Not everyone is meant for big decisions." More laughter. I smiled. I always did. I didn't correct them. I didn't explain that I hadn't been an admin in years. I didn't mention the long nights, the closed-door meetings, the approvals that decided whether companies lived or collapsed. I just watched them enjoy the version of me they'd created, safe, small, non-threatening. Ethan lifted his glass. "Tomorrow decides everything," he said proudly. "If the bank says yes, we're back on top." I wanted to says and the reasons time. I raised my glass too, meeting his eyes. "Tomorrow," I agreed. They had no idea that by then, the joke wouldn't be funny anymore. In my family's version of events, I was never the main character. I was the sensible one. The quiet one. The one you don't worry about because she doesn't make noise. From the time we were kids, Ethan Bennett was framed as the future. He was loud, confident, and reckless in a way my parents found charming. When he took over parts of the family manufacturing business in his late 20s, every small success was treated like proof of destiny. Missed deadlines were growing pains. Bad hires were learning experiences. Losses were blamed on the market, never on him. I was different. I studied hard, kept my head down, and learned early that praise in our house was a limited resource. When I got my first job out of college, my mother smiled politely and said, "At least it's secure." When I moved companies, no one asked why. When I worked late nights, they assumed it was because I didn't have a life worth going home to. To them, I was the safe option. The backup child. The one who wouldn't embarrass them but also wouldn't impress anyone they cared about. That perception followed me everywhere. At family gatherings, I was seated next to the kids or the relatives between careers. Conversations about growth, leverage, and risk conveniently skipped over me. If money came up, my father would pat my hand and say, "You wouldn't enjoy this part, Claire. It's complicated." And I let them believe it. Not because it was true but because correcting them never changed anything. Explaining myself only made them uncomfortable or defensive. So I stopped trying. Meanwhile, the family business quietly unraveled. Contracts dried up. Suppliers tightened terms. A few risky decisions piled up faster than anyone admitted. By the time they started talking about a $5 million loan, it wasn't ambition anymore, it was survival. Still, they never connected me to that world. To them, I was just Claire, with my basic job, my modest clothes, my predictable life. The irony was almost funny. They trusted banks. They trusted titles. They trusted the image they'd built of themselves. They just never thought to question the one they'd built of me. What my family never bothered to ask was where I worked or what my job title actually meant. They heard finance and filled in the blanks themselves. Cubicle. Spreadsheets. Someone else making decisions while I followed instructions. It fit the story they were comfortable telling, so they never looked closer. The truth was quieter. Less flashy. And far more inconvenient for them. For the past 4 years, I'd been an investment director at a private lending firm that specialized in high-risk commercial loans, the kind companies turned to when traditional banks hesitated. I didn't just prepare reports. I reviewed balance sheets that could make or break hundreds of jobs. I sat in rooms where silence followed numbers no one wanted to explain. I was one of the final sign-offs, including on loans in the 8-figure range. I learned early in my career that authority doesn't announce itself. The people with real power don't talk the most, they listen, take notes, and decide later. So when I saw my family's company name appear in my pipeline weeks earlier, I didn't react. I didn't panic. I didn't celebrate. I read their projections. Their cash flow assumptions. The optimistic forecasts that ignored past losses. I saw the gaps they hoped no one would question and the risks they quietly buried under confident language. It wasn't fraud, but it wasn't solid either. It was the kind of proposal that depended heavily on charm, timing, and someone being too impressed to say no. And the most ironic part? I had flagged the file myself for additional scrutiny. Not because it was my family's business, but because if it hadn't been, I would have done the same. That was my job. No favoritism. No shortcuts. No emotional exceptions. Sitting at that dinner table, listening to Ethan mock my basic job, I felt a strange calm settle over me. They talked about the bank like it was some distant, faceless machine. They spoke about approval as if it were inevitable. They had no idea that the person they underestimated the most had already read every number they were betting their future on. And they had no idea that silence, in my world, usually meant someone was already deciding. The next morning, we arrived at the lending firm's downtown office just before 9. Glass, steel, polished stone, everything designed to signal control and certainty. My family walked in like they already belonged there. Ethan led the way, shoulders back, voice loud enough for the receptionist to hear. My father followed, greeting people he'd never met as if they were old friends. My mother adjusted her scarf, scanning the room for reactions, measuring worth by reflected attention. I trailed a few steps behind, carrying nothing but a slim notebook. At check-in, the assistant glanced at our names and smiled professionally. "Please have a seat. The committee will be ready shortly." Ethan leaned toward me and whispered, "Don't stress. This part is boring anyway." I didn't respond. When we were ushered into the boardroom, the space opened wide, long table, soft lighting, city views stretching behind the chairs at the head. Several committee members were already seated, quiet, observant, laptops closed, pens aligned. No small talk. My family, however, filled the silence easily. Ethan launched into introductions before anyone asked. He talked about momentum, market confidence, and inevitable growth. My father nodded along, jumping in with stories about legacy and resilience. They spoke quickly, confidently, barely pausing for questions. When a committee member asked about recent losses, Ethan laughed lightly and said, "Every expansion has bumps." No one laughed back. I was placed near the end of the table, slightly out of the center line of sight. No one introduced me. No one asked why I was there. I could have been an assistant for all they cared. At one point, while a risk officer reviewed the agenda, Ethan gestured vaguely in my direction and said, "Claire won't have much to add here. She's more operational." I would win of the purses 2IFTS. Operational. Another word for invisible. A few committee members glanced at me not dismissively, just curiously, then returned their focus to the presentation. I met no one's eyes. I took notes. The arrogance was subtle but constant. Answers that drifted around numbers instead of landing on them. Confidence used as a substitute for clarity. Assumptions that approval was a formality, not a decision. As they spoke, I recognized every weak point I'd already marked weeks earlier. The gaps didn't shrink under pressure, they widened. Still, no one stopped them. Not yet. The meeting moved forward, polite and controlled, but something had shifted. The room felt quieter, heavier. The committee wasn't impressed. They were listening. And for the first time that morning, I felt the weight of every assumption my family had made about the room, about the process, and about me settling into place. The turning point didn't come with drama. It came with a pause. After Ethan finished another confident explanation, The chair of the committee, a woman with calm eyes and an unreadable expression, closed her notebook. She glanced down the table, then stopped at me. "Claire," she said evenly, "you've been quiet. Would you like to add anything?" The room shifted. Ethan turned toward me, confused. My father frowned slightly, as if trying to remember why my name sounded familiar in this setting. My mother's smile faltered. For a moment, no one spoke. I set my pen down carefully and looked up, not at my family, but at the committee. "Yes," I said. "Thank you." I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stated facts. For clarity, I continued. "My name is Claire Bennett. I'm the investment director overseeing commercial approvals for this division. I've reviewed the Bennett manufacturing proposal in full, including supplementary risk assessments." Silence dropped like a curtain. Ethan's face drained of color. My father's mouth opened, then closed again. My mother's hands tightened in her lap. I went on, calm and precise. "Per our process, I serve as the final sign-off on loans of this scale, alongside the committee." No one laughed. No one interrupted. The chair nodded once, confirming it without a word. I finally turned toward my family. Ethan stared at me as if I'd spoken in another language. My father looked embarrassed, then alarmed. My mother avoided my eyes entirely. The joke from the night before replayed in my head. Paper pushing. Basic job. I felt no satisfaction, only clarity. "This isn't personal," I said, returning my attention to the table. "But accuracy matters." The silence stretched, thick and absolute. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was final. In that quiet, every assumption they'd carried into the room collapsed under its own weight. And for the first time, they understood that the meeting was never about convincing the bank. It was about whether I would approve them. I didn't change my tone after the reveal. That was important. Emotion would have made it easier for them to dismiss what came next as personal. I wasn't there as a daughter or a sister. I was there in my role, doing the job they had mocked. I turned back to the screen and spoke plainly. "The proposal shows projected revenue growth of 32% year-over-year," I said. "However, the last 3 quarters show declining margins, rising supplier costs, and delayed receivables that aren't addressed in the forecast." Ethan shifted in his chair. "Those are temporary issues," he said quickly. "Once the expansion—" I raised my hand, not aggressively, just enough to pause him. "Expansion amplifies weaknesses before it fixes them. Right now, your debt-to-cash flow ratio exceeds our threshold." The room stayed silent. No one rushed to save him. I continued. "There are also inconsistencies between the operational data submitted to us and the figures provided to your secondary lender. That doesn't indicate fraud, but it does indicate risk." My father leaned forward, voice strained. "Claire, we can explain." "I'm sure you can," I said evenly. "But explanation doesn't change exposure." I didn't look at them when I said the next part. I focused on the committee, where the real decision lived. "Based on current data, I can't approve this loan under the requested terms," I said. "The risk profile doesn't align with our standards." The words hung there, heavy and irreversible. Ethan's confidence collapsed into panic. "This loan keeps people employed," he said. "This is family. You know what this business means." I finally looked at him then, not as his sister, but as someone who'd read every line he'd signed. "I know exactly what it means," I replied. "Which is why approving a loan that could accelerate its failure would be irresponsible." The chair nodded slowly. Another committee member made a note. No one argued. "I'm open to reconsideration," I added. "If the structure is revised, projections corrected, and independent audits completed." But as it stands, the answer is no. My mother's breath caught. My father stared at the table. Ethan looked at me like I'd betrayed him. But I hadn't. I'd done the one thing no one in my family had ever done consistently. I'd chosen reality over comfort. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. If my name hadn't been Bennett, the decision would have been accepted without question. Blood didn't make the numbers safer. It never had. The meeting moved on, professional and controlled. But for my family, everything had already changed. The meeting ended the way professional meetings always do, with polite thanks and carefully neutral expressions. But the moment we stepped into the hallway, the tone shifted. Ethan grabbed my arm. Claire, wait. I stopped, gently pulling free. My parents closed in behind him, voices lowered, urgency replacing arrogance. We didn't know, my mother said quickly. You never told us. I nodded once. You never asked. Then I way. My father cleared his throat, eyes darting down the corridor as if someone might overhear. This didn't have to happen like that, he said. You could have warned us. Helped us prepare. Helped them hide the flaws, he meant. Helped them feel in control. Ethan's voice cracked. You embarrassed us in there. That was when I understood. Not one of them had said we were wrong. Not one had apologized for the jokes, the dismissal, the years of minimizing. Their regret wasn't about how they treated me, it was about how exposed they felt. I didn't embarrass you, I said calmly. I answered a question honestly. My mother reached for my hand. I stepped back. Claire, your family, she said. There has to be a way to fix this. There is, I replied. Fix the business. Silence followed. They didn't like that answer. It didn't put me back in the role they understood, the quiet one, the helpful one, the emotional safety net. Ethan shook his head, frustration hardening into something sharper. So that's it? You just walk away? I looked at him steadily. I walked away a long time ago. Today, you just noticed. They stood there, stunned, while I turned and headed for the elevator alone. Their apologies echoed behind me, hollow and conditional. They weren't asking for forgiveness. They were asking for leverage. And for the first time, I didn't give it to them. I took the elevator down alone, the soft hum filling the silence they'd left behind. I expected anger to catch up with me. Or guilt. Or regret. None of it came. What settled instead was something calmer, clarity. For most of my life, I thought being quiet meant being overlooked. I thought silence made me smaller, easier to dismiss. But that day taught me the difference between being unheard and choosing not to speak. Silence, when it's intentional, isn't weakness. It's restraint. It's control. My family mistook my privacy for insignificance. They believed that value had to be announced, defended, proven out loud. I didn't correct them, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. Real power doesn't argue for a seat at the table. It decides who gets approved. I didn't walk out feeling like I'd won. I walked out knowing I no longer needed to. And that quiet certainty was stronger than any apology they never truly meant. If you've ever been underestimated, laughed at, or quietly dismissed by the people who were supposed to know you best, I want you to know this: your worth does not require their permission. I didn't win by proving them wrong with words, I won by staying grounded, prepared, and honest with myself. In real life, power often comes from patience, boundaries, and choosing integrity over approval. If my story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in my place? Would you have approved the loan or chosen the same boundary I did? Drop your perspective in the comments. Your voice matters here. And if you want more stories about self-respect, quiet strength, and standing your ground, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and join the conversation. You're not alone, and sometimes, silence really is the power.